Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. This is the time in the session where folks are, coming into the door, finding their seats. Just wait a few seconds here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. More folks coming in. Ideally, we would love to have had a tea station set up, some evening snacks. But unfortunately, all you get is my banter. Welcome, welcome. Hello, hello.
Oh, Blair.
Hi, Blair. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. As you're joining, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat to connect with other participants. You can share your name, your pronouns, your organization, how you're arriving, as we get settled in for our evening session. So good evening, everybody. My name is Erin Kang. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the project lead for Reimagining Governance at the Ontario Nonprofit Network.
And I'm Linda Mollenhauer. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-lead from Ignite NPS.
So we're joining you this evening from Takaranto, known as Toronto, from the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. This morning, during our opening prayer, led by our elder Constance Simmons, she reminded us that as people working in this sector, as people living on this land, guests on this land, that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. And as we do our work, both in our professional spaces and our personal spaces, and also tonight, as we begin to talk about the future of governance, new ways of working, I really urge us all to think about how will we be good ancestors, and really wanting to name and manifest the teachings of reciprocity and connectedness as we do this work and explore this work together. So once again, welcome to our session. We are going to be sharing a very brief overview of our initiative. This is actually the third nonprofit-driven session that we've had for Reimagining Governance, one every year. And so each year kind of has shown a progression in our work, in our thinking. So tonight we're really excited to be spending the bulk of the time actually sharing some insights with you from some iterative spaces that we have been hosting called Learning Labs, which we will tell you a little bit more about in a moment.
Great. Well, for those of you who are new to Reimagining Governance, the goal of the initiative is to provoke a shift in the way that we talk about and do governance in nonprofit organizations. We're hoping this generates new approaches and some innovations. And by innovations, they can be big, hairy ones or smaller pivots that create ripples across an organization's governance structures, the processes they use, the people involved, or the culture.
So before we really dig in, I'd actually love to start with a little bit of a story anecdote. So there is a wonderful show called Abstract, The Art of Design. It was available on Netflix. I'm not quite sure where it might be right now, but one of the episodes actually focuses in on a toy maker named Cass Holman. And this toy maker really described a time where children's playgrounds were undergoing a big revolution. There was this big push to reimagine playgrounds and reinvent the playground. But what really was happening, what Cass observed, is that in this desire for innovation, actually, all that was really happening was sculptural changes. So for example, taking a slide and just reproducing the slide, but it's in the shape of a giraffe. Or the set of swings is still a set of swings, but the thing that you sit on is a tire, not, a wooden plank or something like that. So really sculptural changes to the playground. And Cass explains that this kind of change, this kind of surface level change was actually just designing for the same kind of play. It wasn't enabling a new mode of playing. So it wasn't actually innovation, it wasn't actually revolutionary. And so Cass, being the toy maker that they are, really tried to shift the conversation to, rather than trying to think about reproducing this, let's say, slide, why don't we think about what is its purpose? What is the core, the spirit of this slide? It facilitates a fleeting sense of weightlessness, right? It gives you a momentary release, right? So what are those functions? And how else can a playground facilitate that? So rather than just designing the same playground items and making them look kind of different, really fundamentally trying to recreate those moments. So the episode goes on to show that Cass actually created these really interesting, innovative toys called Rigamajigs, and they really facilitated a new experiential and very educational form of play that was very different from just presenting children with another slide. And so I share this story because really in our work with reimagining governance, we're asking ourselves, what are the moments that we want to design for, right? How else can we facilitate that core, that purpose of governance?
Oh, yeah, lots of people have that now.
And design it differently. And so designing for these moments and really applying that to our governance design.
Great. I think that's a great analogy and so much captures what we're trying to do. And we recognize that it is very ambitious what we're trying to do, but we also think it's really, really timely and important to do. So in just a minute, snapshot, why is it important to reimagine? Well, first, because the environment is very different than it was when many of the governance models and practices were put in place. It's exponentially more complex and requires a lens that better matches that complexity. And that's something that we've been working on. Second, if we're going to find innovations, then we can't just tinker and fix. We need to ask bolder and braver questions, like, why do we keep naming the problem to be solved as creating more diverse and inclusive boards, which is very important to do. But the challenging question is, how do we bring in a diversity of perspectives into governance? Not just in terms of the composition of the board, which means sharing power and creating more agile and distributed decision-making. Third reason to reimagine, because our research found that we need to do some serious reimagining to attract and retain emerging leaders to the work of governance. And finally, we need to reimagine because we can. We're discovering that there's lots of room to play with governance design. There's not nearly as much that's fixed and binding as people assume. So we've been co-creating a lot of processes, tools, and resources that we hope will unlock these new approaches, generate different kinds of conversations, and promote a much more intentional governance designed for an organization's unique circumstances.
Exactly. And bringing it back to the playground analogy, it really is about expanding that notion of what we mean by governance, who's involved in governance decision-making, and really intentionally thinking about what is the purpose here and how else can we get there? So I'm going to be sharing with you now a very simplified version of a journey, a process that we have co-created through our work. And this is sort of what we are testing in spaces that we have called learning labs. So learning labs are a very iterative two-way learning exchange that we are hosting currently with 7 nonprofit organizations who are really committed to over several months and many sessions with their board and their senior leadership, really sitting with us and doing that work of uncovering what the purpose is, examining the functions of governance, really digging into these tools that we have created. And the reason that we decided to go with this kind of learning lab space as opposed to kind of piloting something that we already finished was to really invite this co-iterative nature to how we're doing our work, so that once we are able to share things with the broader sector and just let organizations run with the things that we have been working on, that they've been grappled with by real organizations who are doing real work on the ground. So they're really co-creating these tools and resources with us. And tonight, we're going to be sharing a couple of the insights that have really come up from that work, as well as some of the tools that aren't publicly available yet because we're still fine-tuning them, but wanted to give a little sneak peek at what that stuff looks like. So really these things are a work in progress. We have a great team where we've been working with Lisa Villeneuve and Heather Graham, who are consultants who are working with us to really co-facilitate these learning labs with us. So our intent is to wrap up these labs by December. We thought that we would be done by September, but things take the time that they take. And so we really hope to be refining everything and making everything available by early spring.
Great. Okay, so we wanted to share two light bulb moments and two log jams that emerged in our learning labs. And by light bulb moments, we mean those big ahas, a discovery like, oh, so we don't actually have to keep doing it this way, or wow, so this approach can be done in a very different way. As Erin said, this is just a sneak peek because they're still evolving. So the first light bulb moment that we had is that it's important to start with purpose, not structures. So a number of our learning labs, we're looking at their governance structures and how to more broadly engage stakeholders. The natural starting place was to look at what was already there and to make it better. For example, by creating clear role definitions, by energizing people or improving meetings. Our light bulb moment was that we were coming at this the wrong way. If we just focused on fixing structures and strategies, we'd be missing an opportunity for innovation. We needed to suspend or park the existing strategies and structures and to go to purpose for the engagement. In other words, what governance decisions need to be made? It's the old adage, let form follow function. So we played with some tools in the lab, and I think some interesting things began to emerge. We'd like to share 5 of those tools that we utilized. One was exploring organizational circumstances. Another was mapping stakeholders. Third was naming governance decisions. Fourth was identifying competencies. And the last was populating an engagement continuum.
Thanks, Linda. So before we move to sharing the tools, I'm going to share another anecdote with you. And so I really love bringing up this example, which was shared by a Seattle-based nonprofit leader, Vu Le. You might recognize that name from our keynote speaker last year at Nonprofit Driven. But Vu wrote a blog post that described an experiment that was done between 2 groups of children. And well, the experiment was done on children, but it could, be applied to many people. Basically, one group was shown a picture of a fish, and they were instructed to draw a fish, any fish. You don't have to use this example, but here's this example, And what ended up happening is that the children just drew a whole bunch of fish that looked pretty similar to that example fish. Now, the second group was not shown any kind of example, but were just told, hey, draw a fish. And so these children drew all these different kinds of shapes of fish. Some had different numbers of fins. Maybe some of them were jellyfish or made up fish, right? So the point is that because this group was shown a template, right, an existing example of how to do things, they just gravitated towards something that looked really similar to that. But when you don't give an example, that's where that space of innovation really starts to become more possible. So in the light bulb moment that Linda shared, and forgive me, you'll see me kind of looking around because we're sharing so many things with you. I have to keep them all in track. But we want to start by showing you a method where we mapped an organization's organizational circumstances. And so I'm going to show you, and you don't need to really like look into all of the text, but what this really shows is 9 different aspects of an organization's circumstances that actually impact how they do governance work. So as an example, the organization's history, the organization's culture, the membership, its life cycle, all of these different things that aren't necessarily explicitly tied to governance actually shape governance in either really significant ways or not very significant ways. So the big aha moment here was that there's actually so much room for doing things differently and finding new ways of doing stuff, because very little is actually binding, is actually dictating how organizations do their governance. And we also, through this mapping, discovered that a lot of structures that might exist, such as advisory committees, other councils, things like that, might exist as much because of historic precedent than anything else. So, an organization who in their life cycle is 90 years old, perhaps 50 years ago, put in place some structures to facilitate their governance work that in this current day don't actually work anymore, but are still there because it's a legacy, right? And so it really began to free up people's thinking about what could be, because we could show what wasn't fixed and immovable. And just to further dive into that, we then took those things and mapped it onto a continuum to show, what, these are the only things that are truly dictating what your governance design has to look like. These are the minimum specs. But these are all the things that are more fluid. Maybe they impact how you do your stuff a little bit, but they can change. Maybe some things are more based on, things in that moment in time. But again, it's that getting clear on what actually is not fixed so that we have room to play and to innovate.
Great. One tool down. The next tool was we looked at the organization's ecosystem and all of their stakeholders, and asked for people to think about who is impacted and connected to the organization. We intentionally didn't contain the exercise by asking who should be involved in governance, because that might be find itself very limited by assumptions. Assumptions like harder to reach people or clients can't add value. Another, you need in-depth knowledge about governance to contribute. The people we traditionally engage are the right ones, or funders shouldn't be influencing governance, so we wouldn't name them, but in fact, they can play a significant role in shaping governance decisions. So that was the reason we wanted to step back, not let any assumptions get in the way of who the stakeholders were. We also stayed away from naming structures like committees or members or volunteers, and instead pulled them apart to name the people in them, because as I said earlier, the key piece is not to start with any kind of structures, but start with a much more expansive view. And we pulled apart, as you can see sort of in this mapping example, big categories like clients and partners into smaller segments because they aren't homogeneous. We asked people to pull them apart, thinking about their relationship to the organization, their interests, their unique characteristics. So that was a second exercise, all towards trying to think about what is the purpose and who could be involved in governance.
Yeah, absolutely. So much happens when you open the question from who should be involved to who could, and also what are the risks of someone not being involved, right? What are
Yes.
we missing? So yeah, those are all such great questions. The next thing that we wanted to really focus in on is thinking about governance, tasks, and decisions. And so you all might be familiar, if you've seen our governance framework, we've taken the functions of governance and really tried to hone in on them. We've identified 8. You'll notice some big things that are often associated with board work, such as fundraising or advocacy, are not here because we've really tried to pull apart that governance work from other kinds of important, crucial work, but really focusing in on governance. And so we used this backdrop of the governance functions, which are available. This whole document, the framework here, is available on our website. And you'll see that they range from very generative and strategic kinds of governance functions to more highly routine ones related to things like compliance and managing assets. Now, we use this as a prompt to, in our learning labs, really think about what exactly is it that we want to engage people in. Right? We can't just say, okay, we need more people involved in our governance. Let's, get a bunch of people to sit on a committee. But it really gets to that intent or that purpose of engagement. And so what we did, let me pull up the other thing here. That's the actual juicy part. What we did was we started to pull each function apart into associated tasks and decisions. So you'll see that we have them on a continuum. It ranges from more simple or transactional, maybe more straightforward on the continuum, to maybe there's more complicated decisions. Maybe it involves more than one party. There's different interdependencies in that work. You might need different levels of expertise, all the way to complex, where there's more wicked questions. There's significant changes that might affect multiple parts of the system, because of course within complexity is emergence, and there's a lot of people and systems that are involved. And so what you'll see is that first of all, no one decision kind of just only lives in one area. They can actually be pulled apart. So this red kind of shows in the moment in our labs, we were kind of drawing connections between some of these different things. So a really great example would be, perhaps the work of actually identifying emerging threats and opportunities is more complicated work, but figuring out how to respond to those emerging threats and opportunities, perhaps that's more work that lives in complexity and therefore needs different kinds of people involved, different strategies of doing that work. And so this part of our lab really helped us stay focused on the what. So we put aside the who, we put aside the how, and really focused on the what, and placed these decisions on the continuum. So one of the very interesting observations here was that a lot of the time, those big, hairy, juicy decisions that have to happen aren't very commonplace, right? They're not happening every day. They're pretty sporadic in nature. And in some cases, those big strategic decisions might actually be dictated by outside folks like government funders. So for instance, they might really have very clear ideas that drive your program outcomes and directions, and therefore have significant implications on your overall strategy. So what this means is, if that's the case, it would leave those more routine tasks, the ones that might not benefit as significantly from that deep and broad stakeholder engagement. Therefore, it begs the question, how to respond to these different kinds of decisions, right? And if there are a lot of these routine tasks, could they also be offloaded from the board and done by different governance bodies in order to reduce the burden on the board? So another interesting observation as well is that a decision like what our strategic priorities can have oh, I just shared this, is that, again, they can be really simple and transactional, such as how to monitor the progress of strategic priorities, all the way to complicated, which would be how we decide which ones to prioritize, to the complex kinds of decisions, which could be, looking at the emergent opportunities and issues, understanding how to respond. So again, just really important to pull these apart, have a more expansive view, because these different aspects really require different levels of engagement and have implications on how you do that work. One committee is not going to do all of the governance work all the time, right?
And nor is the board.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. And so the other thing that we looked at, all towards the end of thinking about how to engage stakeholders more broadly in decision making, was the looking at competencies. And by competencies, I mean the skills, the knowledge, the lived experience that is really critical for a governance decision making. So we asked people to transport themselves to a new world where they can get all the competencies required to do governance brilliantly. I did say it wasn't this world, it was another world, but and the reason we asked them to make believe is that otherwise we inevitably start from constraints of who's already in place. There are a lot of insights that surfaced about what's present currently in our governance leadership, including not only the board, but also in sort of advisory groups and the executive director, the management team. So what's present, what's missing, and where those competencies might be, it helps then to be able to explore where those competencies could be found beyond in the board, and also beyond the board. And the other tool that we've developed, and it plays into this, is we called it Board Essentials. And the reason the Board Essentials describe what a board must do based on legal and regulatory requirements. It really strips down to what they must do, and that they're the only entity that can fulfill these responsibilities. But the reason we did it wasn't just to be sort of an educational piece about the min specs around what the governance, what the board needs to do, but because we thought that if we can start thinking about all of the competencies, and then if we can think about, all right, what must the board do? And in a way, park that. Then it starts to open up conversations about what could be delegated, shared, or done by others. And this plays into the idea of what competencies would be needed to do that. So as another tool that we've been practicing and playing with, that creates a sort of a more expansive view of what governance could look like.
Ooh, all right. We're at the halfway point. It's evening. We have talked a lot. I have more to say, but let's just take a breath and reground. Shake it out. Okay. Regrounded. So after doing all of this work, one of the things that was really helpful for us was to really consider a continuum of engagement. And so we've done the work of, thinking about all of the different people who are impacted by the organization's work. We've thought about, pulling those apart, really getting intentional about asking who are those people. We've pulled apart governance decisions. We've considered those minimum specs of the board. Now, what do we do with all this information? So what we did was we've shared this continuum. So it ranges from inform all the way over to delegate. These are very simple descriptors. This is not perfect yet. We're also grappling with even the word delegate. And so just very work in progress. But basically speaking, inform is very just one way. I am informing you what we're doing, all the way to consult, asking for input. Maybe you'll do something with it, maybe you won't. Involve, really being hands in that decision, really informing what it looks like, not just maybe I'm heard, maybe I'm not. Collaborate, really negotiating on those joint decisions, to delegate, which is actually having the power to make those decisions. So what we did with this continuum is, remember, we're talking about form should follow function, right? So rather than jumping to right away talking about those structures, those processes that we need, we got to make a committee, to choose a governance decision, really just focus in on one thing, and then place the list of stakeholders on this engagement continuum. Because the reality is, not every group or person or network is going to want to be involved in every level of decision or every kind of decision. And it's that intentionality that's really important here, right? It's also not just about asking, what do we need from people? But also, what are the expectations that our community has of us in regards to their involvement in governance? So it's really, again, that expansion of what we're talking about. And so doing this brought up some really interesting key questions to grapple with, right? Like, what is the cost or benefit of engaging in certain groups on this decision? Or what are the realistic expectations that we can set? How do we build in equity and inclusion into this selection process, especially given, let's say, all the different organizational circumstances or external forces at play? And so it really allows for people to hone in on specific governance work, specific governance decisions or questions that need to be addressed, and really intentionally think about who could, who should be involved in this work and how. And then allowing that to feed into, okay, what kinds of processes or structures could support that? Okay.
Great.
Turn it back over
So
to
the fun, or Erin and my idea of fun, comes in putting it all together, as she just described, like a jigsaw puzzle. The insights gained from these explorations will make the job of figuring out, make it easier to figure out the best structures and process. But even more importantly, what we are hoping that it does is to really unlock some innovations and getting people to think about outside of the things that they've always been doing. So we want to take a minute just to summarize just very quickly some of the learnings we just talked about.
Yep. So learning number one, start from purpose, not from existing structures. Pretty straightforward, pretty everything we've been saying this whole session. The second emergent insight is there's room for innovation. When you explore these circumstances, you will probably find that you have a lot more space to play than you think. And also, when you think about stakeholder engagement, thinking broadly, not just naming existing structures, but thinking about who are the people that we're hoping or expecting to populate in those structures. Those are the stakeholders, not the committee.
Think about how governance decisions can be pulled apart as simple, complicated, and complex, because it will help to determine what competencies are needed and who can best contribute to them. When considering governance competencies, don't be constrained by what is currently in place, because it's going to box in your solutions. And finally, if you can, start from the right-hand side of the engagement continuum. Start from an assumption that a stakeholder group could help in making decisions, not just in informing decisions. And if that really doesn't make sense, then move over to the left towards inputting and informing decisions. Because it's far more comfortable a conversation. It's where most people would go to the part of the continuum that is inputting to governance decisions. But we are encouraging organizations to have maybe perhaps more challenging conversations to who could we place over in the collaborate and delegate category in ways that would reduce the burden on the board and expand the richness of governance decision making. So those are the key takeaways, we hope.
Yeah. And I know that Linda and I are presenting things in a way where it sounds like it's all been a party and everything's just been rolling smoothly. But of course, that's not the case. Innovation is messy. We go up and we go down. And so in this work, because we're in a place of emergence and exploration, we've also come up against some log jams, right? Like places that we've really gotten stuck. And so we thought in the spirit of co-creation that we would maybe share one of the big things that we're grappling with you. And I know some of you are on Zoom and some of you are on Feedloop, but would love to know what you think. So as organizations are creating new governance structures and processes, there could be a feeling that power is being taken away from some people, right? As it's being redistributed or reconsidered throughout the system, there could be feelings of, oh, okay, well, now I don't have a voice. And so how to navigate that change, right? How do we help people to go along that journey with us, to understand that actually, maybe sitting on the board isn't the only way or the right way or my right way to have a voice in governance decision making. Maybe how I want to be involved is more time dependent or more theme dependent. And so really thinking about how can we do this kind of change work and navigate this feeling that power might be taken away from people. So I'm just gonna let you think about that, let that percolate for a moment. Yeah, please share your thoughts in the chat. We'll sort of revisit this question in a moment after we go over our next light bulb moment. So Linda, I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Okay. So another light bulb moment within our learning lab was discovering the place culture plays in governance decision making and in the design of governance structures and processes. Governance culture, we learned, can be very prevalent, but it's often unintentional. In other words, people have personal values, biases, and ways of thinking. The governance leaders have personal values, biases, and ways of thinking, but they're often not named or explored in terms of how they actually shape governance.
Sorry, I was just answering a couple questions here. Give me one moment to pull up the appropriate visual. Okay, so as we've been working through this question of governance culture, we've sort of come up with this graphic to help guide our thinking. And so ignore the question themes for a moment. I'm going to focus on the iceberg here. So you'll see that there's sort of 3 large levels. Again, it's very simplified. There's going to be nuance. It's not perfect, but at the very tip of the iceberg, you're going to see the intended culture. These are the things that are formally declared, things that the organization says that the culture should be. So might show up as, values, etc. The experienced culture, which is sort of straddling that line between being visible, being maybe a little bit more murky, is how governance culture actually is experienced and unfolds in practice. So this could be seen and named. It might or might not match up to that intended culture, but it's that more murky gray area. So that's our experiences. And then there's the deep invisible aspects of governance culture, which really are driven by the mindsets that we hold. So the influences and it influences and shapes how governance culture is experienced. And so even though something could be declared, the mindset that I hold could actually completely go against what is declared, but I might not be aware of it because of my unconscious bias. And so we've been using this tool to really explore governance culture specifically. I can't remember if Linda just mentioned, but often organizations will focus in on their organizational culture, but not as much as their governance culture. So one of the tools that we've been testing, and this is the least tested of the tools that we have, so more learnings to come. What we've done is designed, again, a reflective sort of process where governance leaders, and when we say governance leaders, we do mean board members, the ED, senior directors, like those people who really have a hand in governance decision making, to answer a set of reflective questions. It took folks about an hour. They were divided into these 5 kinds of themes. Governance decision making, like how are decisions made, the governance work environment, how stakeholders are engaged, how strategic choices are made, also leadership styles, and really created a bit of a snapshot, not an evaluation, right? Not an assessment of the organization's governance culture, but just, hey, in this moment in time, here's a reflection of what you answered your governance culture to be. And so what this did is that it showed that the lens through which the board and management actually interpret and process what they hear, it could be like ears wide open, but actually there's a collective and individual filter that screens information and therefore really influences how people decide what's important or not, or what's actually being said, whose views are considered as more valuable. So if the board and management are very cohesive in their values, their beliefs, their mindsets, it can be a really good thing. It can be very helpful when you're arriving at consensus or you're making tough decisions. But it also could indicate, that there's some groupthink. But if there's a great diversity of perspectives and beliefs, life experiences, it can also be harder to manage, but also that there's not any echo chambers, right? So really the most important learning here is how much governance culture really matters and needs to be made visible. Linda, I have to apologize. I think I took that part from you. I'm just going to keep going.
You did it beautifully. So perfect.
Literally learning as we go. So as just a couple examples of the kinds of questions, they ranged from things like, to what degree does your organization's values actually authentically drive your governance decisions? To more, of that murky area of how safe do you feel in sharing your ideas and opinions? And then kind of trying to get to those deeper mindset questions, we asked, how were difficult decisions navigated when your organization was going through conflict or had a tough call to make? What happened? How did that decision get made? Who was involved, and really asked a lot of these open-ended questions in order to try to shine a light on governance culture. Okay, so getting to the emergent insights. The first one is that it's really tricky. It's really hard to get at the stuff below the surface. And this is really, we're looking at this through the lens of governance, but this is heart work. This is internal work. It is deeply looking at, ourselves. And so it can be challenging to ask, board members, leaders to take that time to do this work. But we're finding it's really, really important. And a lot of the time also we're not aware of what we don't know, right? We're not aware of the mindsets that deeply drive, how we interpret the world. And so it's layered, it's complex. This is where issues of equity and power come into play. So yeah, it's really tricky.
Which is why this is very much still a work in progress. trying to figure it out. But we think that if we can figure out what exactly those questions need to be and what the process needs to look like, that it's going to be a very helpful tool for governance. And we think it'll really help people uncover some ideas of how it could be done differently. Another learning we've had is that organizational culture, the organizational and governance culture can be aligned, but they're different. And lots of organizations have done lots of work on organizational culture. But what we're discovering is that you can have a strong organizational culture and it may carry over into the board culture, but it may not always be aligned. And that is often not because there's an intentional misalignment, but it's because there hasn't been any kind of a deep dive into the specifics of the culture that is driving governance decision making and the mindsets that's driving it. So we think that it's really important. It's complementary, but important to distinguish between the organizational culture and the governance culture, and really explore it with intentionality.
So the third insight here is that culture exists, at the collective level as well as the individual level. So one of the things that I think is really important to name is that, when you have a team of people, it's not just the sum of all of their individual views and perspectives. They also coalesce, right? Once you're in that group and when you're in relationship with each other, there's these more hidden parts of culture that will surface just by nature of you being in a group. So one of the things that helped us arrive at this insight is one of the questions that we asked in our lab was to place on a continuum, we love continuums, to place
clearly
where they thought they sat in terms of certain mindsets. So for example, ranging from being totally focused on solving immediate issues to totally focused on future issues, where would you place your governance perspective, like in that continuum? Or from being totally focused on what our stakeholders need and want to totally focused on, getting revenue and making sure there's enough revenue, where would you place that self on the continuum? And when we asked folks to do that, a lot of the time, what happened was people were like, well, I'm going to think about the other people in the group. And so we got just a lot of things placed in the middle. And so we learned it would have been way more insightful if we asked people to place themselves individually and then maybe later on collectively, because it shows that different a different relationship. So just acknowledging that culture is not this static thing that just is, it's this nebulous thing that is going to exist at the individual level all the way up to the collective.
Exactly. And often when people answer those kinds of collective questions, there's a bit of groupthink that goes on. So we're learning to pull that apart and ask for people to share their own personal comfort where they sit. And we think that's going to generate some more insights than the groupthink approach. The last insight on this particular light bulb is governance culture is more than the board. We often hear, not always, but often hear that board does governance. So when people think about governance culture, they're often talking about board culture. But we're learning that it's important to recognize that the ED and management mindsets, perspectives, their beliefs can deliberately and powerfully shape what is brought to the board and how issues are framed. So when we were doing our reflective questions, we asked the management team and CEO or ED, as well as the board, to fill out the reflective questions. And so it was very helpful to see where there was alignment, where there was a differentiation in terms of cultural values. Very interesting when we started looking at leadership styles, because we call all of those people governance leaders. So that was a sort of another learning that we took away.
Alrighty, so what we're going to do at this point is we're going to share our final logjam question, which is just, a thing we're thinking about that we'd love to pose to the group. And then I'm also seeing a question in the chat that we will address as well. So the thing that we've been thinking about is, we're really up against this thing that people, as I said, we're not really aware of what our mindsets are, right? And therefore doubly not aware of how they might impact how we make governance decisions. So there might not be that time, that desire, the capacity to actually invest in exploring something as deep as governance culture. It takes time, it's a commitment. And so persuading organizational leaders of the importance of really intentionally exploring and defining it and understanding how it impacts their work, it's a challenge. So we wanted to just ask you, is it important to shine a light on governance culture? And do you agree with what we've been saying? Like why or why not? So I'm going to pose that to you while Linda and I answer this great question from Annette of has our work been received differently between nonprofit directors and those from the business sector? I'll just answer very quickly, Linda, before passing to you. We have been focused on, of course, engaging with and working with folks in the nonprofit sector, but we've come into contact with folks who are outside of the sector. And I would say that this is, again, sort of where culture, values, mindsets really comes in, because those who are already thinking, right, about equity and power sharing, decision-making, like expansiveness, they might be way more willing to have this conversation with us than someone who might have a more traditional view, and that's okay. We really are focusing in on those early adopters and folks who really want to dig into these messy questions so that we can share examples and we can share stories. And that's really what we hope the next phase of this work to really focus on, is sharing stories. So Linda, I don't know if you have anything to add to Annette's question.
I would just add to that we've taken in the creation of tools and resources and ideas, we've taken lots of great stuff from the corporate governance arena, but there is clear distinctions, and so as Erin said, at the end of the day, all that we're talking about has been very much customized to not-for-profit organizations as opposed to corporate governance.
Thanks, Linda. At this time, I'm just going to check in both with our lovely audience and my colleagues to see if there's any other questions or feedback that has been coming in regards to the questions we posed. But I'm also going to just put up our contact information so that you can get in touch with Linda and I. I'm seeing Rose saying, I think that shining a light on governance culture would be useful when trying to recruit new board members and other organizational leaders. Yeah, it's a really great point. Pam saying, while I think it's important, it also can become a huge headache for those who are in small nonprofits with just one staff. Absolutely. And this is sort of, that tension is, this is deep work. So really recognizing those barriers to doing this work.
Yes.
I'd like to just bring up this question of, can you speak to the issue of involving service users in decision making? Is it possible, ethical to have good governance without them? Linda, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, it's interesting because as we've explored these, this question of more shared decision making, that's been very front and center, and so I'm not sure I would comment on the ethics of not involving them, but I would talk about the importance of involving clients in decision making. And it's been fascinating, the conversation, because as we moved along that continuum, towards delegate and collaborate, where you're negotiating, actually making decisions together, one of the characteristics people surfaced that was really important for any stakeholders that are involved in that end of the spectrum was that they don't have a vested interest, because when you're making governance decisions, you have to some degree suspend your own particular vested interest and think about what, I mean, it's kind of your duty of loyalty and care, what is best for the organization. So that actually, we've had lots of conversations about that, which was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. I would also add on that it touches back to what I said about what are the expectations, right, that folks have in how they shape your governance decisions. And so, perhaps it doesn't look like having, half the board be service users. That might not be the best approach to take, but rather, what do our service users expect and want from us, having a good understanding of that, and considering that alongside what are the governance decisions that you need to make, and kind of trying to find that balance. I'm also just wanting to address some questions that I've been getting around graphics that we've shown that are not in the presentation deck. And so I just want to share that the things that we shared with you are very much works in progress. They are, we've generalized the answers on them, and think that they're going to be incredibly useful tools, but they're not ready for public sharing yet. However, if you sign up for our listserv, that is where we will be sharing everything as it comes available. So currently on our website, you'll see our board essentials, which are those minimum requirements, legal requirements of the board, as well as the governance framework, which really outlines that really expansive view of governance as a complex system. Very soon, we're going to have a new resource, which focuses in on the impacts of outside trends and forces on governance design. And so as our tools become ready for you to use, that's where we're going to share them. So I really encourage you to sign up for that. And I'll say sorry that those aren't ready yet, but we're really hustling over here trying to make them ready as soon as possible.
Yeah,
so,
but when we do make them ready, we want to be sure that we've got the full benefit of all the learning labs, the full insights that have come from that before we sort of set them in stone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just want to shine a light on a couple comments here before we wrap up. So believing it's critical to shine a light on governance culture. Most directors simply can't tell me the process that leads to a board decision, for example, and so they can't figure out when and how best they can contribute. Thank you, Jane, for that. As well, thinking about governance culture as applying beyond the board. Thank you, Joey. Absolutely. Maybe those service users are engaged in an advisory capacity or in specific ways where they don't necessarily need to have the fiduciary responsibility or liability of a traditional decision maker on the board. Maybe you should join the team, Joey. And then finally, a question here of, since we live in a vibrant multicultural society, have you looked at governance from different worldviews? Thank you so much for this question. And I think that, in this part of our initiative, we're really looking to the people who can be involved to bring those governance, those different worldviews in. We know that there's so many things to look to. There's Indigenous perspectives on governance. There's Afrocentric perspectives on governance. There's so many different ways that challenge the traditional view of governance. And so we're trying to look to those as much as possible. But if you have more things to share with us, our email's right here, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I would really encourage you on both questions, any insights that come to you, please feel free at any time, because we really take seriously when people provide that kind of input.
Absolutely. So yeah, any last words, Linda, before we say goodbye?
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's come this evening and kind of shared in our journey, because it is a journey, and so it's been fun to sort of be able to share with you some of the emergent learnings we have so far, and we assume that there's going to be lots more.
Yeah, just going to echo that. Thank you all so much. We're always really excited to hear from folks, so please do get in touch. As we mentioned, we're hoping to wrap up our learning labs by this winter and start to really make things better, make these tools more accessible for you for the spring. And yeah, just really appreciative that you took your Wednesday evening to spend with us talking about governance. We're really stoked about that. So thank you. And we'll see you tomorrow at day 2.
I think everybody here really appreciates the way you managed to cram all that into an hour and still make it somewhat fun. Thank you so much, and I've missed seeing your faces.
Thank you. I think that was Jane. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Have a good evening.